The letter was not meant to be read aloud. That was the thing Louisa kept coming back to, afterward. Not the humiliation itself, not the gasps around the long table, not the way the candlelight had caught the paper as Philippa held it up like evidence at a trial. What she kept returning to was the simple, almost childish fact that the letter had been private. It had been folded, sealed, tucked into the lining of her travelling case where no one was supposed to look, and yet Louisa Fennick had not expected her marriage to the Viscount Ashby to be easy. She had not expected much at all, if she was honest with herself. She had spent too many years being practical for that. At 26, she was the daughter of a coroner in Guelph, Ontario, a man of modest reputation and considerable debt, who had died of a lung complaint the previous winter and left her with the house, the accounts, and the very clear understanding that she could not afford sentiment. She had grown up watching her father examine the dead with the same careful attention he gave to everything. The angle of a bruise, the colour beneath a fingernail, the way a body told its story even when the person inside it no longer could. She had learned, sitting in the corner of his office at 12 years old, that facts were kinder than fiction in the long run, even when they hurt. It was a useful lesson. She had applied it to the marriage negotiations, the same way her father had applied it to an inquest. Lord Ashby, Viscount Ashby formerly, though she had already begun to think of him privately as just Emmett, was the kind of man who appeared, at first meeting, to be almost aggressively unremarkable. He was not particularly tall. He was not what anyone would call handsome in the way that made women turn in doorways. He had brown hair going slightly grey at the temples, steady hands, and the habit of listening to a person complete their entire sentence before he said anything in return, which Louisa had found so unexpected, the first time it happened, that she had actually stopped mid-thought and stared at him. "You were saying," he had said mildly, "that you think the estate ledgers from the last decade should be reviewed before any marriage settlement is discussed." "Yes," she had said. "I was. That seems reasonable," he had said. And then he had actually sent for the ledgers. She had not fallen in love with him then. She was not the sort of person who fell anywhere, as a general rule. But she had thought this one might be survivable. What she had not accounted for was Philippa. Emmett had one sister, his younger sister, Philippa Ashby, who had lived in the family house at Thornfield since their parents died, and who had, by all available evidence, come to regard that arrangement as permanent. Philippa was 23, handsome in a sharp-featured way, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone whose opinion she respected. She had written one letter to Louisa before the wedding. It had been perfectly polite. It had also, Louisa had sensed reading it, been the letter of a person marking territory. She had tucked that feeling away with the practical part of herself, and chosen not to mention it to Emmett. The wedding had been small, a solicitor's chapel in the village, a handful of guests, the kind of quiet ceremony that Louisa preferred, and that Emmett, she suspected, had arranged specifically because he understood that about her without being told. Afterward, they had driven out to Thornfield in the late October light, the trees already stripped bare, the house appearing at the end of the lane, like something from a painting she had once seen in her father's office. Grand and slightly melancholy, and older than anyone currently living in it. Philippa had been standing on the front step. She had embraced her brother warmly. She had given Louisa a smile that was entirely correct and contained nothing behind it. "We're so glad you've arrived safely," she had said, in the tone of a woman welcoming a house guest of uncertain duration. Louisa had smiled back. She had understood then that this was going to require patience. The first 2 weeks were a careful kind of warfare. Nothing was said directly, nothing needed to be. Philippa rearranged the schedule of the household in ways that left Louisa feeling perpetually one step behind. She made decisions about the kitchen menus that were Louisa's to make now, and then expressed mild surprise when it was pointed out. She referred to the housekeeper, Mrs. Graves, by her Christian name, a familiarity built over years, in a way that made very clear to everyone in the room, including Mrs. Graves herself, who the real mistress of this house was considered to be. Louisa did not fight. She watched. She had learned from her father that the surest way to understand a situation was to let it continue until the pattern became clear, The pattern became clear on the 15th day. She had been in the small room off the main corridor that she had claimed as a study. Not the formal drawing room, which felt performative, but the narrow, book-lined room that smelled of old paper, and faintly of cedar, which reminded her of home. She had been writing. Not to anyone in particular. She had kept a private journal since she was 13, the kind of record that was only ever meant to be read by herself, frank, sometimes unflattering, frequently unkind about people who deserved it. It was the place where she said things she had no other outlet for. She had left the journal in the desk when she went to meet Emmett for dinner. She had not locked it. There had seemed no reason to. It was a private room. It was her private room. But that evening, while she sat across from her husband over cold chicken and warm wine, she had looked up to find Philippa watching her with a new expression. Something careful, something she had not seen before. Not hostility. Something more like assessment. The look of a person who has just come into possession of information they are deciding what to do with. Louisa had not said anything. She had finished her dinner. She had excused herself and gone back to the study, and found that the journal had been moved. Not far, not dramatically, but moved, replaced at a slightly different angle on the desk than she left it. She had sat with that knowledge for 3 days. She had not told Emmett. He had enough to manage, she reasoned. The estate accounts were genuinely a mess. She had been quietly working through them, and what she was finding was not good. There were gaps, irregularities, the kind of careful omissions that looked like negligence from a distance, but looked, on closer examination, like something more deliberate. She had not yet decided what to say about it or to whom, but the journal sat in her chest like a stone. It was not the content she was afraid of, exactly. She was not ashamed of what she had written. She was a coroner's daughter. She had grown up understanding that the truth of things was rarely tidy or comfortable, and she had always written with that understanding, honestly, sometimes harshly, but never falsely. What she had written about Emmett in those first private weeks was not unkind. What she had written about Philippa was accurate. It was the accuracy she suspected Philippa had found useful. The dinner party was Philippa's idea. Emmett mentioned it to Louisa one morning over breakfast. 12 guests, a formal dinner, an opportunity to introduce the new Viscountess Ashby to the neighbourhood. He had said it in the tentative way he sometimes had, the way that told her he was not entirely certain it was a good idea, but had already agreed to it. It was Philippa's suggestion, he said. Yes, said Louisa, I imagined it was. He looked at her for a moment. He had the good sense not to ask her to explain. She spent the intervening days preparing. She reviewed the guest list, 12 names. Most of them local landowners and their wives, people she had not yet met. She spoke to Mrs. Graves about the menu, this time making certain to do so in writing, so there could be no question of who had made which decision. She chose her dress with the same methodical attention her father had brought to a complicated inquest. The blue silk, she thought, the one with the high neckline that had been fashionable 4 years ago, and was now slightly behind the times, which she did not mind, because it was the most comfortable thing she owned, and comfort, she had found, was worth more than fashion when you were expecting a long evening. She almost did not look in the mirror before going down. She almost did not notice, but she had stopped just briefly and looked and thought, I look like what I am. A practical woman in a sensible dress in a house that is not yet her home. And then she had smoothed her skirt and gone to the landing. The guests arrived in the early evening. Emmett stood beside her at the door, and she noticed that he placed himself slightly closer to her than was strictly necessary. A small warmth she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. Not dramatic, never demonstrative in the way that would embarrass her, but present. He was good at being present. She got through the introductions. She was good at that, too. She had spent years at her father's side, watching him manage grieving families and defensive magistrates, and the kind of witnesses who came to an inquest convinced they already knew what had happened. She knew how to ask a question that made a person feel heard. She knew how to say very little while appearing to say quite a lot. By the time they moved to the dining room, she had the names and approximate situations of all 12 guests memorized, which she privately considered one of her more useful skills. The table was long, longer than she had expected, candlelight running its whole length, the good silver out, the room warm and smelling of beeswax and roasted pheasant. She sat at the foot of the table, as was correct, with Emmett at the head. Philippa was seated to his right, which was also, Louisa noted, correct, and which placed her at exactly the right distance to be visible to Louisa across the length of the table without being close enough to read her face clearly. The first course passed without incident. The second course passed in the same way. Louisa was speaking with the wife of a local solicitor, a sensible woman named Mrs. Trent, who had a dry wit and opinions about land drainage that were surprisingly well informed, when she became aware that Philippa had stopped eating. She had stopped eating, and she was watching Louisa with that expression again. The one from the first evening, assessment. Louisa did not look away. She continued her conversation with Mrs. Trent. She lifted her wine glass, she set it down again. And then Philippa spoke, loudly enough to carry across the table, loudly enough to pause the conversations on either side. "Tell me, Louisa, have you always kept a journal?" The room did not go silent. Rooms rarely do, in Louisa's experience, at the first sign of danger. But conversation slowed. Attention shifted the way water shifts when something is dropped into it. "Most people, with a habit of observation, do," Louisa said pleasantly. "How interesting." Philippa reached into the small satin bag at her wrist, the kind that women of fashion carried to evening events, and which Louisa had not thought to wonder about until this moment, and produced a folded sheaf of papers. "I found this so compelling, I thought others might appreciate it as well." Louisa looked at the papers. She felt the stone in her chest become very still. She knew immediately what they were. Not the journal itself, too large to be carried in an evening bag, but pages copied from it or torn, she could not yet tell which, in Philippa's handwriting if copied, in her own if torn. She thought, with the strange clinical clarity her father's training had given her, she has had this planned from the beginning, not since she read the journal. From before, this is what the dinner party was for. "Philippa," Emmett said from the head of the table. "There's a passage," Philippa continued, unfolding the papers, "about the estate accounts that I think the assembled company would find quite—" "I would ask you," said Emmett very quietly, "to put those down." The room was silent now. Philippa looked at her brother. Something moved across her face. Surprise, Louisa thought, or the recalculation of someone who had expected a different response. She had expected, Louisa understood, for Emmett to be as embarrassed as she was. She had expected him to want it contained, managed, minimized. She had not expected him to be quiet in the way he was being quiet now, which was not the quiet of a man trying to keep peace, but the quiet of a man who had run out of patience very specifically. "These are my wife's private papers," he said, still quietly, "removed from a private room. If you read them, you have done her a wrong. If you intend to read them aloud, you propose to compound that wrong before 12 witnesses. I would ask you, again, to put them down." Philippa's chin went up. "You haven't heard what's in them. It doesn't matter what's in them." "She's written about the estate accounts. About discrepancies she believes she's found. Inconsiderable. Philippa." His voice was still level. It was, Louisa thought, the voice of a man who had been practicing that level for a very long time. "There is nothing in those pages that changes what you have done. You entered your sister-in-law's private room. You read something that was not yours to read. And you have come here tonight intending to use it to damage her. That is who you are at this table, in front of these people. That is what you've shown them." The silence was complete. Mrs. Trent, beside Louisa, set her fork down with the small, careful click of a woman deciding something. Philippa looked around the table. Louisa watched it happen, the slow realization that the room was not with her, that the faces turned toward her were not the faces of people prepared to be entertained by scandal. They were the faces of people watching a young woman embarrass herself very badly in front of people who would remember it. Louisa said, calmly, "The pages, please, Philippa." Philippa set them on the table. Louisa rose from her chair, walked the length of the table, the whole length of it, all 12 guests watching, and picked them up. She did not look at them. She folded them in half and set them beside her place setting. "Mrs. Trent," she said as she sat down again, "you were telling me about the drainage problem on the East Field." Mrs. Trent, bless her practical soul, said, Yes, I was. Now the difficulty is that the previous assessment was done in a dry summer, which rather skewed the—" and the dinner continued. Philippa did not speak again for the remainder of the evening. She sat at the head of the table, to Emmett's right, in her correct position, and ate, or appeared to eat, and said the things required of her when spoken to, and left before the last guests had been seen out. Emmett found Louisa in the study afterward. She was sitting at the desk. The pages were in front of her, still folded. She had not opened them. She had been trying to decide how she felt, which was not something she usually permitted herself to do in real time. And she was finding that the usual mechanisms were not entirely working. He sat down in the chair across from her. He did not say anything immediately, which she had come to appreciate about him. "The accounts," she said finally. "The irregularities I found. They're real." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I've known for about 3 months," he said. "I wasn't certain at first. And then I was, but I couldn't. I didn't know how to." He stopped. He put his hands flat on his knees. "It's Philippa, some of it. Not all of it. She's been managing a small income from the estate that was supposed to go to household expenses and redirecting it. It's not a large amount. It's not what a court would call significant. But it's consistent, and it's deliberate, and it's been going on since before our father died." Louisa was quiet for a moment. "She needed money that wasn't dependent on your decisions. Yes, she was afraid of what her position would be when you married. Yes, she should have asked you." "Yes," he said for the third time. "She should have." He was quiet again. "Then, what you did tonight, walking the length of that table. I've never seen anything." He stopped again. He looked at her with the expression of a person who has recently been surprised by something they hadn't known they needed. "You didn't have to be kind about it." "I wasn't being kind," Louisa said. "I was being efficient. Making a scene would have been interesting for about 45 minutes and uncomfortable for the next 4 decades. I'm not built for scenes." "Your father's daughter," he said with something in his voice she couldn't quite name. "He would say," she said, "that a body tells its story whether it means to or not. Tonight, Philippa told hers." He was quiet again. Outside, the late October wind had found its way under the eaves, and the candle on the desk was moving with it, throwing the shadows of the bookshelves up against the wall in long, uneven shapes. "She'll have to leave Thornfield," he said. "Not permanently, but for a time. I have a cousin in Edinburgh who—" "That's for you to decide," Louisa said. "She's your sister. She's also your family now," he said, "if you want a say in it." Louisa thought about this. She thought about the letter Philippa had sent before the wedding, the one she had recognized as territorial. She thought about the 2 weeks of careful misdirections, the moved journal, the dinner party, the satin bag. She thought about a young woman who had been so afraid of becoming unnecessary that she had made herself dangerous instead. "Edinburgh," she said, "for now, and a proper allowance, settled in writing. That isn't dependent on your mood or mine. Something she controls herself." He looked at her. "You're giving her what she was trying to steal." "I'm giving her what she should have asked for," Louisa said. "There's a difference." She turned back to the pages on the desk. She unfolded them now for the first time. Read a few lines of her own handwriting, her own thoughts, copied out in someone else's hand, which was a strange sensation, like hearing your voice played back on a recording and not recognizing it at first. She read the passage about the accounts. She read a few lines about Emmett. She refolded the pages. "Were you offended?" he asked carefully. "By what you'd written? About me? Why would I be offended by my own writing? You know what I mean," she considered. "I wrote that you were the most unexpectedly decent person I'd met in a very long time," she said, "and that I didn't entirely know what to do with that." He was quiet. "I still don't particularly," she said, "but I'm working on it." Outside, the wind had settled. The candle steadied. The long house was quiet around them in the way that old houses become quiet. Not empty, but absorbed, a particular kind of stillness that belongs to places that have held a great deal of living and are simply waiting to hold more. He did not move from the chair across from her. She did not ask him to. Philippa left for Edinburgh 3 weeks later on a Wednesday morning with 2 trunks and a draft for a settled income drawn on the estate account and countersigned by Louisa. She did not embrace Louisa. She did not apologize. She looked at her, at the foot of the front steps, for a long moment with an expression Louisa couldn't read, and then she looked away and got into the carriage. That, Louisa supposed, was enough. for now. The estate accounts took 4 months to fully reconcile. Louisa did it herself in the study, with the ledgers spread across every available surface and a pot of tea that she kept reheating on the small iron stove in the corner. Emmett came in and out, sometimes to look over her shoulder, sometimes just to sit in the other chair and read, as if the presence of someone working carefully made the room a better place to be. He never interrupted. He brought her tea when she forgot to reheat it. Once, when she had found a particularly infuriating discrepancy that turned out, after 3 hours, to be a simple arithmetic error from 1887, he had listened to her describe it with the focused attention he gave everything she said, and then observed, dryly, that he had always found the late Viscount's bookkeeper to have the penmanship of a man actively hostile to legibility. She had laughed. She had not been expecting to laugh. She was not, in general, a person who laughed easily, and the sound of it had surprised her somewhat, and she was aware, in the way you are aware of things when they are new and fragile, that she was being careful with this one. By spring, the accounts were in order. The estate was solvent. The drainage problem on the East Field, which she and Mrs. Trent had discussed at some length after their interrupted dinner conversation, had been addressed through a practical solution involving redirected channels and a modest capital outlay that was well within budget. She wrote to Philippa twice. She received one letter in return, brief, formal, and containing, in its last paragraph, an acknowledgement of the allowance that was as close to a thank you as Louisa suspected she was going to get. She filed the letter with the rest of the estate correspondence. She wrote back promptly about practical matters and did not mention the dinner. In June, she wrote in her journal, a new journal, begun after the old one had been retired to the bottom of her travelling case, with a small brass lock, that she had begun, gradually and with the caution appropriate to a person whose father had taught her to examine things carefully before drawing conclusions, to feel that Thornfield was hers, not in the way that things are claimed loudly and with witnesses, in the way that things become yours over time. Because you have sat with them in the dark and learned their drafts and their silences and decided to stay. She wrote that Emmett had, the previous evening, told her something she had already suspected from his behaviour over the preceding several months, and that she had told him something in return that had taken her longer than she had expected to find words for, and that neither of them had been particularly eloquent about it, which seemed exactly right. She wrote that there was a window in the study that faced east, and that she had begun to wake up early enough to see the light come through it, which she had not done since she was a girl in her father's house, and had not expected to do again. She closed the journal, set it in the locked drawer, and went downstairs to where Emmett was waiting with her tea, already hot, the morning coming quiet and unhurried through the east window over the long fields.